The world of showbiz has been left stunned by the sudden death of screen legend Sam Neill, just weeks after revealing he was cancer-free.
On the 13th of July, 2026, the world lost a man who had spent 5 decades quietly becoming one of the most beloved actors of his generation, and almost nobody saw it coming. Sam Neill was gone at 78, and the timing made no sense to anyone who had been paying attention. Just 3 months earlier, he had stood in front of a camera and delivered the kind of news cancer patients dream about giving. His body was clear. No trace of the disease that had chased him for years. He sounded like a man who had gotten his life back. And then, without warning, he was gone. And the woman who felt that loss the hardest wasn't a director or a producer or even a family member. It was an 18-year-old girl he once protected on a boat, decades before the world knew either of their names. In April of 2026, Sam Neill sat down for an interview in Australia and said something that most people fighting cancer never get the chance to say out loud. He had just come from a scan, and it showed nothing. No cancer anywhere in his body. He described it as an extraordinary thing to hear, and the disbelief in his voice was obvious. The tone of someone who had spent years bracing for bad news and had almost forgotten what it felt like to receive good news instead. That relief had been a long time coming. Neill had first told the public about his illness in his own memoir, released in early 2023. The diagnosis was angioimmunoblastic T-cell lymphoma, a rare and aggressive form of blood cancer that most people have never even heard of, let alone had to fight. In interviews around the release of that book, he was remarkably candid about how bad things had gotten. At one point, standard chemotherapy simply stopped working. He later admitted that things did not look good, that he genuinely did not know if he would come out the other side of it. It was not the kind of thing actors usually say in public. Most keep illness locked away from interviews entirely. Neill didn't. What ultimately turned things around was his enrollment in a clinical trial for a treatment called CAR T-cell therapy, a newer form of cancer treatment that essentially reprograms a patient's own immune cells to hunt down and destroy cancer with far more precision than traditional chemotherapy allows. It worked. By the following spring, he was well enough to talk publicly about wanting to take on another film role, sounding like a man with plenty of road still ahead of him. He had said more than once in earlier interviews that he wasn't particularly afraid of dying. After this week, people listening back to those old clips heard them completely differently. 2 months after that hopeful update, everything changed. On July 13th, Neill died in Sydney, Australia, at St. Vincent's Private Hospital, surrounded by his family. His loved ones released a statement on his social media that used a single word that stopped people cold: sudden. Not a relapse. Not a slow decline anyone had been quietly preparing for. Sudden and unexpected, they wrote, while also making a point of noting that Sam remained cancer-free at the time of his death. That detail, more than anything else, is what made the loss so difficult to process for so many people. He had won the fight that mattered most, and something else took him anyway. The family did not release a specific cause of death right away, choosing instead to focus their statement on gratitude, thanking the staff at the hospital by name for the care he received in his final hours. Only days later, Neill's longtime agent stepped forward to clarify the cause publicly, saying it was pneumonia, and explaining that he wanted to correct what he called inaccuracies circulating in the press. It was a small, human detail buried inside a much larger story. A man who had beaten a rare blood cancer against long odds, only to be taken by something far more common. He was 78 years old, and only weeks earlier he had been talking about future film roles, like a man who fully expected to be around to make them. Within hours of the announcement, tributes started pouring in from people who rarely comment publicly on anything at all, including heads of government in both New Zealand and Australia, a level of recognition usually reserved for major public figures, rather than character actors, known mostly for supporting roles across 5 decades of film. But it was one particular tribute, from a woman who had known him since she was a teenager on her very first major film set, that explained better than any official statement why his death hit Hollywood as hard as it did. Long before Nicole Kidman was a household name, she was an 18-year-old actress from Australia who had just landed one of the biggest roles of her young career. The film was Dead Calm, a tense psychological thriller released in 1989, and it required her to carry enormous emotional weight for a performer barely out of her teens. She played a young wife trapped on a yacht in the middle of the open ocean with her husband and a dangerous stranger who boards their boat mid-voyage. It's the kind of role that can make a career or quietly end one before it starts. Her co-star, playing her husband, was Sam Neill, who by that point already had a decade of work behind him in New Zealand and Australian film. He was established. She was not, and by every account that has surfaced since his death, he chose to use that gap between them not to overshadow her, but to protect her. He took her under his wing on that set, treating a teenage newcomer like she genuinely belonged there rather than someone simply tolerated until the cameras stopped rolling. That kindness on a single film set turned into something that lasted for the rest of his life. The two of them stayed close for decades afterward, long after Dead Calm had made its money, and both of their careers had moved on to far bigger things. Kidman's path eventually led to an Academy Award. Neill's path led him through some of the most memorable roles of the last 30 years. And through all of it, the friendship that started when she was 18 never faded into the kind of professional politeness so common in an industry built on people drifting apart the second a project wraps. In 2019, 3 decades after they first worked together, the two of them ended up on the same stage again, this time for a Big Little Lies panel alongside Laura Dern. By then, their reunion barely registered as unusual to the people covering it. It felt like old friends catching up, because that's exactly what it was. In the hours after Neill's death became public, Nicole Kidman released a statement describing herself as immensely saddened by the news. What she said afterward is the part worth sitting with. She called him one of the greats and a joy to be around, and she went back to that first year on Dead Calm, describing how meeting him at 18 changed the way she experienced the entire industry from that point forward, because he took her under his wing, and the two of them remained friends for life. Not just colleagues who happened to share one film decades earlier and never spoke again. She described him as charming, kind, funny, and intelligent throughout their entire friendship, and said he would be greatly missed, extending her sympathy to his family. It's a short statement, only a handful of sentences, but it carries the weight of nearly 40 years of loyalty behind every line. This wasn't a publicist-drafted tribute to a former co-star. This was someone genuinely mourning a person who had shaped who she became, both as an actress and as a person navigating an industry that isn't always kind to 18-year-olds handed enormous responsibility on a film set. Kidman was far from alone in describing him that way. Across dozens of separate tributes from people who had never worked with each other, the same words kept surfacing again and again. Kindness, warmth, generosity. It happened so consistently that it stopped looking like coincidence and started looking like the honest, repeated observation of an entire industry that had quietly known something about this man for decades and simply never had the occasion to say it all at once until now. To understand why so many people felt they had lost something personal, it helps to go back to who Sam Neill actually was before Hollywood ever knew his name. He wasn't born Sam Neill. He entered the world as Nigel John Dermot Neill, born in Omagh, Northern Ireland, in 1947. His family moved to New Zealand when he was 7 years old, after his father, himself a New Zealander, left the army and brought the family home to the South Island. At school, surrounded by other boys who also happened to be named Nigel, he switched to Sam instead, a name he later joked simply sounded friendlier, a little more like a dog's name than his own, a bit he clearly enjoyed repeating throughout his life. He described his childhood self, in his own words, as an awkward, nerdy kid, someone who stuttered and wasn't particularly athletic, not the kid anyone expected to end up on movie screens around the world. His break came in 1977 with a low-budget New Zealand film called Sleeping Dogs, the first feature made in the country in over a decade, produced on a shoestring by filmmakers determined to prove a national film industry could exist there at all. It opened doors across Australia soon after, and from there his career expanded across 5 decades and nearly every genre imaginable, moving fluidly between art house drama and studio blockbusters in a way few actors of his era managed. In the mid-1980s, he even screen-tested for the role of James Bond, arguably the most coveted role in the industry at the time. By his own account, his heart simply wasn't in it during the audition, and he later admitted he was more afraid of becoming a version of Bond that audiences wouldn't like than he was afraid of losing the role outright. By the time his health became public knowledge, Neill had already built one of the more unusual careers in modern film: a submarine officer in The Hunt for Red October, a grieving husband opposite Holly Hunter in the Oscar-winning film The Piano, a paleontologist chased by dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, a menacing crime boss in Peaky Blinders, and a gruff but loving uncle in the beloved New Zealand comedy Hunt for the Wilderpeople, a role many of his own countrymen considered his most personally cherished. He was knighted in New Zealand in 2022 for his contributions to film, and received a Screen Legend Award in 2025, accepting it with the same self-deprecating humor that defined nearly every interview he ever gave. What made the sudden nature of his death land so hard was how openly Neill had chosen to talk about his illness in the years leading up to it. He revealed his diagnosis publicly in his 2023 memoir, describing a stage 3 case of angioimmunoblastic T-cell lymphoma and the difficult stretch of treatment that came with it. Rather than retreat from public life the way many actors in his position might have, he kept working and kept talking to journalists honestly about what he was going through, including the periods when it genuinely looked like the disease might win. He also never lost his sense of humor through any of it. He was known for naming farm animals after his Hollywood friends and for cheerfully recounting, in interview after interview, the unfortunate fates some of those animals met at the hands of local wildlife. Those stories became a kind of trademark, small proof that even while fighting for his life, he refused to stop being funny about it. He remained active on causes he cared about right up until the end. In early 2026, he released a short environmental documentary opposing a proposed industrial gold mine in the central Otago region of New Zealand, the same rolling hills where he had spent decades running his own small organic winery, a project he started in 1993 with the modest goal of making a Pinot Noir good enough for his friends to actually enjoy drinking. A close friend, the Australian comedian Magda Sabansky, later said she had spoken with him not long before his death, and that he sounded cancer-free, genuinely happy, and excited about everything still ahead of him. That account lines up exactly with the hopeful interview he gave in April, and it's part of why the ending still feels so difficult to reconcile for the people who knew him. Within a day of the announcement, tributes arrived from nearly every corner of the industry Neill had touched across 50 years of work, the kind of widespread response usually reserved for stars who dominated a single era, rather than someone whose most memorable roles were spread across several completely different decades and continents. Steven Spielberg, who directed him as Dr. Alan Grant in Jurassic Park, called him exceptionally collaborative and noted how strange it had felt directing someone so warm in real life to play a character so famously annoyed by children on screen. Laura Dern described a lifetime friendship built on loyalty and protectiveness. Cillian Murphy, his Peaky Blinders co-star, called him one of the kindest and gentlest people he had ever worked with. Toni Collette wrote that he was the most decent, beautiful gentleman she had ever known, a hero and a legend she already missed deeply. Alec Baldwin, who worked with him decades earlier on The Hunt for Red October, said he had always hoped they'd get the chance to work together again. Director Colin Trevorrow called him a deeply soulful man and said it isn't every lifetime a person gets to befriend someone people would go on to describe as a legend. Even actors who had shared only a single film with him decades ago took the time to post something personal rather than the generic, publicist-approved statement. New Zealand's Prime Minister and Australia's Prime Minister both issued formal statements, an unusual honor for an actor whose earliest work came from a film industry that barely registered internationally when he began his career in the 1970s. Carl Urban, who came up through the New Zealand film industry a generation behind him, credited Neill with helping build a national film scene that barely existed when he first started out in the 1970s, calling him a trailblazer for an entire wave of New Zealand actors who followed in his footsteps. Rachel Griffiths, who directed him in her own directorial debut years later and worked with him again as recently as 2023, said she planned to open a bottle from his own winery that same night, simply to mark the loss properly, in the exact quiet, unpretentious way friends who knew him say he would have wanted. Kylie Minogue posted a short farewell, using a word both New Zealanders and Australians commonly reach for in exactly this kind of moment, a small gesture that said more than a long statement might have. Almost none of those tributes led with Jurassic Park, despite it being the role that introduced him to millions of people who never saw any of his other work. Instead, they led with kindness, humor, and decades of quiet loyalty. The exact same qualities Nicole Kidman had described about the older co-star who chose to look out for an 18-year-old actress on a small boat, nearly 40 years before the rest of the world felt the full weight of losing him all at once. What makes Sam Neill's career so unusual, looking back on it now, is that it never followed the typical arc of a movie star. Most actors who reach his level of recognition have one defining decade, one stretch of 5 or 6 years where every role lands and the momentum carries them for the rest of their working life. Neill's career didn't work that way. He had defining moments scattered across 5 completely different decades, in completely different countries, working with completely different generations of filmmakers, and somehow he stayed relevant and respected through all of it, without ever chasing the kind of fame that keeps an actor's face on magazine covers. In the 1980s, he was becoming a serious dramatic actor in New Zealand and Australian cinema, appearing in art house films that rarely crossed over to American audiences, but built him a reputation among people who took film seriously. By the early 1990s, he had crossed over into major Hollywood productions, playing a submarine officer opposite Sean Connery in The Hunt for Red October, and then, just a few years later, becoming a household name to an entire generation of children as the paleontologist running from genetically engineered dinosaurs in Jurassic Park. That same decade, he delivered what many critics still consider one of the finest performances of his career, playing Holly Hunter's husband in Jane Campion's The Piano, a film that won 3 Academy Awards and remains one of the defining works of 1990 cinema. By the 2010s, rather than settling into smaller, safer roles, the way many actors do once the biggest blockbusters are behind them, he took on one of the most menacing performances of his later career as a ruthless crime figure in the television series Peaky Blinders, introducing him to an entirely new generation of viewers who had never seen Jurassic Park and had no idea he'd spent decades building a career before that role even existed. Around the same time, he appeared in Hunt for the Wilderpeople, the beloved New Zealand comedy that many critics and audiences alike consider one of the best films to come out of the country in years, playing a gruff, reluctant father figure to a troubled foster kid in a role that felt, by every account from people who worked with him, close to who he actually was in real life. That kind of range, spread out across so many decades without ever losing momentum, is exceptionally rare, and it's part of why the tributes that poured in after his death came from such wildly different corners of the industry. Directors who worked with him in the 1990s and directors who worked with him in the 2020s were saying almost identical things about him, which is not something that happens by accident. For all the roles and all the decades, Neill never seemed particularly interested in the trappings that usually come with a career like his. He spent much of his life away from the major entertainment hubs entirely, choosing instead to live on a farm in the central Otago region of New Zealand, where he ran 2 paddocks, the small organic winery he founded in 1993. Friends who visited him there described a man far more interested in talking about his Pinot Noir, his farm animals, and the surrounding hills than about any film he'd ever made, a detail that came up again and again in the tributes written after his death. That same land became the subject of the environmental documentary he released only months before he died, a project born out of genuine concern for a region he'd called home for decades, rather than any calculated attempt to build a public image. People who worked with him on that documentary described someone who was just as serious about protecting his adopted home as he was about any film role he'd ever taken, which tracks with how consistently his colleagues describe him. A man whose off-screen priorities rarely had anything to do with Hollywood at all. It's worth remembering that this was also a man who, by his own account, turned down the chance to become one of the most famous actors on the planet when the James Bond audition didn't feel right to him. Most actors in that position would have taken the role regardless and figured out the rest later. Neill walked away from it because it didn't sit right, and he built an entirely different kind of career instead, one built on decades of steady, respected work rather than a single defining blockbuster franchise. What ties all of this together, in the end, is the same thing Nicole Kidman pointed to in her tribute. It wasn't the dinosaurs, and it wasn't the knighthood, and it wasn't even the Oscar-winning film that many critics consider his best work. It was the fact that an 18-year-old actress handed one of the biggest opportunities of her young life, and very little protection to go along with it. Found an older, more established co-star who chose to look out for her instead of overshadowing her. That single choice, made on a small boat off the coast of Australia in 1989, turned into a friendship that survived nearly 4 decades of separate careers, different countries, and years without working together at all. It didn't need constant contact to stay real. It surfaced again at a press panel in 2019, and it surfaced one final time this July, in a short, heartfelt statement that told the world exactly what kind of person Sam Neill had been long before Hollywood knew his name. It's easy to watch a career like his from the outside and only ever see the highlight reel, the dinosaurs, the submarine, the gangster suits, the knighthood. What's harder to see, unless someone like Nicole Kidman chooses to say it out loud, is the quieter pattern running underneath all of it. The pattern of a man who kept choosing, project after project and decade after decade, to be decent to the people standing next to him on set. Co-stars twice his fame, co-stars a fraction of his experience, directors working with him for the first time, directors who'd known him for 30 years. They all seem to be describing the same person. That kind of consistency doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen because someone is performing kindness for the cameras. It happens because it's simply who a person is, on the good days and the difficult ones, long after anyone stopped keeping score. That's ultimately why a story that started with a clean cancer scan and ended with a sudden, unexplained loss became something bigger than a celebrity obituary. It became a story about what actually gets remembered when someone spends 50 years in an industry built on image and performance. Not the box office numbers, not the franchise he's most associated with, the 18-year-old he looked out for on a boat, who never forgot it, and who made sure the whole world knew it too. There's a particular kind of grief that surfaces when someone widely known for playing intense, sometimes intimidating characters, turns out to have spent his career quietly being one of the kindest people everyone around him ever worked with. That contradiction is part of what made this loss resonate so far beyond the usual circle of film critics and industry insiders. People who had never met Sam Neill still felt like they'd lost someone they knew, because the story that emerged after his death wasn't really about dinosaurs or submarines or gangster dramas at all. It was about a man who took care of the people around him, consistently, for 50 years, whether anyone was watching or not. Nicole Kidman's tribute captured that better than any headline could. An 18-year-old actress on her first major film, handed enormous pressure and very little protection in an industry that doesn't always look out for its youngest stars, found someone who chose to look out for her anyway. And nearly 40 years later, when the news broke that he was gone, that act of kindness was the first thing she wanted the world to know about him. If someone had taken care of you that way at 18, would you fully understand what it meant until decades later, the way Nicole Kidman clearly does now? If this story moved you, consider sharing it, and stick around for more untold stories from the people who shaped Hollywood from just outside the spotlight.